doing well. I've been having to switch over to a different microphone because my other one is charging. I forgot to charge it. But I want to talk about the Civil War loading. America's in a really tight spot right now, man, socially, politically. And sometimes you can see indicators when there's going to be some sort of controversy or clash. God will show you signs, right? God will reveal to you signs if there were to be something drastic that will happen. So I want to talk about Civil War loading, right? There's been a lot of talk about potential civil war. On Joe Rogan's podcast, he talked a lot about how people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death was a telltale sign to him that, civil war was just inevitable, right? And in a lot of ways, we're already kind of in a civil war in America. You can see it, right? Which is some of the comment. There's a civil war in the comments section, right? Just the differences of opinion among people, just the, you know, slandering, of each other in society today based off of differences. And, even when I joined iShow Speed Discourse, I'm thinking it's going to be just a group where people are just kind of celebrating the speed and, of course, I don't expect the conversation to just totally focus on iShow Speed. But man, those younger people in there ain't doing nothing but just tearing each other apart, man. Just harassing each other. You just see racism left and right. And it's almost normalized in the younger community to just be racist toward each other and say racist jokes. And a lot of times they don't take it personally because they're so used to that way of communicating with each other. But I'm just thinking, like, man, this shit is like a war zone in here. Where do I even fit in, in this type of setting? So there's wars going on left and right, man. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, is there a civil war loading? Right? You got a lot of political figureheads that are talking about this based off of just what they're seeing in the people and politics. So it says you're living in a country that feels like it's arguing with itself 24/7. And a lot of people are quietly asking, is this a kind of modern civil war? To answer that, you have to understand the first Civil War. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 did not come out of nowhere. It was the collision of two incompatible visions of America. So the first vision was built on an economy that depended on enslaved black labor, and another that, however imperfectly, was moving toward a free labor system. Underneath all the political language about states' rights was a brutal reality. The right in question was the right to own human beings. Okay. In the decades leading up to the 1861, every major national argument was really a fight over slavery dressed up as something else. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision all tried to manage a growing crisis. Would slavery expand into new territories or be contained and eventually abolished? Each compromise was like putting a bandage on a wound that kept getting deeper. Slaveholders saw any limit on slavery as an attack on their way of life. Abolitionists saw any expansion as a moral catastrophe. All right. So politics became a zero sum blood sport. Parties fractured. The Whig Party collapsed. The Democratic Party split along sectional lines. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, Southern elites interpreted it as proof that the national system no longer protected their interests. Secession followed, beginning with South Carolina, and within months, shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Newspapers, churches, and local leaders were all preaching competing truths about God, race, and the nation, turning neighbors into enemies. So when people say there's a modern civil war in America today, they don't necessarily mean armies in blue and gray. What they're pointing to is something scarier in a quiet way. Hardened tribes, rival realities, and spiritual warfare over identity, truth, justice, and power. The question is not will there be another Fort Sumter, but are we already living in a soft, slow internal war over whose story counts, whose life matters, and whose version of America will rule the imagination? With that in mind, we have 15 notes, all right, are indicators that civil division is playing out right now. Even a lot of you listening to this are going to be like, a lot of people are not going to even listen to this because of the realities of the division in our country, right? People don't want to hear it, but they're living in it. It's a reality. So, one, politics feels like war, not disagreement. One sign of modern civil war is that politics doesn't feel like arguing with a neighbor anymore. It feels like fighting an enemy. Surveys from Pew show that large majorities of Americans say thinking about politics makes them feel exhausted, about two-thirds, and angry, over half, while very few feel hopeful or excited. That emotional tone, constant outrage, contempt, and fatigue is exactly what you see in a culture that's moved from disagreement to hostility. Even deeper, 8 in 10 US adults now say that Republican and Democratic voters not only disagree on plans and policies, but cannot agree on basic facts. You see this with the government shutdown, right? How many people had to suffer? How much money was lost just because of these two parties? And this was the longest in history. That's very telling, right? That's showing you that currently the division and the differences between these two political parties, between the human connection, is growing so bad that every year, right, every presidency, it's hit or miss if this is going to be the longest shutdown again, right? So it's just getting more severe, even just measured off of the degree of how long this shutdown went down and how they just couldn't come to an agreement. They couldn't agree on basic facts, right? When you and your neighbor aren't just arguing about what to do, but about what's real, you're in a kind of cold civil war over reality itself. Spirituality and spiritually, that's a war for the mind and for perception. Who gets to define truth, identity, and morality? Two Americas, two incompatible realities. In the 1850s, pro slavery and anti slavery newspapers painted completely different pictures of the same events. Today, cable news, podcasts, TikTok, and algorithm driven feeds have created something similar. Two Americas scrolling through two versions of reality. One side sees an existential war on democracy, the other sees an existential war on traditional America. Each camp has its favorite political figureheads, influencers, and pundits who act like generals, pushing talking points that frame the other side as not just wrong, but dangerous and immoral. When 80% of the country believes we can't agree on basic facts, every viral clip becomes a battlefield. Political leaders know this and often weaponize fear. Some lean on replacement theory rhetoric, others amplify the idea that half the country is sliding into fascism. In spiritual terms, that's a war over imagination. If you can make people see their neighbors as monsters, you've already won half the battle without firing a shot. And you even see this with Nick Fuentes, right? Very racist, call it like it is, and kind of maximizes and capitalizes off of the stereotypes and off of his sort of like neuro rigid view of the media's portrayal of certain cultures and certain races, and sort of like just kind of strings some of these different perspectives together, right, in order to create sort of like his own sort of like marketable character, right, in the world today. And he's sort of like just picking up steam because a lot of people sort of like submit to this rhetoric, right? So because what's bad in you means that if I don't have that, then I'm better, right? We live in a very insecure world, right? Where it's big money to play off of people's insecurities, all right? So when you have figureheads who kind of tap into that narrative, right? They just get it's like a rocket, right? They just kind of launch off of these different stereotypes and these different narratives, all right? So Nick Fuentes has sort of like developed sort of like a character and identity, a marketable identity off of extracting all of these stereotypes, media stories, all of these different threads together. So that way he can have certain foundations of talking points, right, to speak to, a lot of the insecurities in our country and the weaknesses and areas of division, right? So he's kind of maximizing off of that. So again, political leaders know this and they weaponize it, right? Race relations as a permanent fault line. Another indicator is how fragile race relations feel, like a fault line under every conversation. Surveys show that majority of Americans say race relations in the U.S. are generally bad. In one Pew analysis, around 58% said race relations were poor, with Black Americans even more than likely than whites to say that things are bad. More recent polling finds that while some whites and blacks say relations have improved slightly at times, there's still a large perception of tension beneath the surface. That tension shows up everywhere from school, board fights, social media dog piles, hiring debates, and even everyday conversations that feel like they might explode if someone says the wrong thing. Even with this rise in Karens, right? These older white women are just making it known, right? Hey, I don't give a fuck, right? If I don't like it, if it makes me feel uncomfortable, I'm going to harass you about it, right? You can record me. I don't give a damn. I'm going to show out even more. What message does that send to the younger women, right? To the younger white girls who may want to go a different way, right? Or who might want to, be innovators, right? What message does that send to your children acting that way and you're elder, right? So when the elders start rebelling, right? In the Bible it says rebellion is like witchcraft, right? You're just sort of like insinuating to the younger generation that, hey, this is the way to go, right? You have a right to be this way, all right? If you feel uncomfortable, if you feel discomfort, even if a motherfucker is just delivering a pizza or walking on your yard, you know, act on that. Be violent, be divisive, right? So it says here, um, spiritually, that's not just sociology, that's a war over worth. Who feels seen, who feels erased, and who feels blame. When people feel that their story is constantly dismissed, they become more open to extreme narratives that promise dignity, even if they come with division attached with them. Hate crimes as warning flares. The FBI's hate crime data is like a stress test for the soul of the country. In 2023, U.S. law enforcement agencies reported 11,862 hate crime incidents involving 13,829 offenses, with 2024 numbers at a similar level. Race, ethnicity, and ancestry remain the most common motivations, with over 5,900 race based incidents, more than half of those anti Black or African American. Those aren't just numbers, they're literal assaults on belonging. So even in the 2025, man, we're still dealing with, you know, racism and hatred towards groups over the color of their skin. It's just so bizarre to me how you can be, we don't have a choice of what race, not unless Elon Musk comes up with some sort of AI technology where you can come before you come to Earth, you can choose what body, you want to be in. I don't know. You guys tell me, but you're powerless to what ethnicity, what culture, what class you're going to be born into, and to see that there's so much hatred and vitriol, towards people over things that essentially human beings are powerless to, which is why I think it's more of a spiritual civil war more than anything, because God put people in certain tents, right, our bodies for a purpose, right? And to see that there's so much war among the tents, there's war among the housing, there's war among the real estate, right? Just kind of shows that they're really warring with God, right? So, because human beings can't control that, right? That's a God conversation. So you're really mad at the Most High. So think of hate crimes as spiritual flare ups, moments when the internal war over race, religion, sexuality, or identity stops being a metaphor and turns into bruises, blood, and funerals. The historical Civil War was about whose bodies could be owned. Modern hate crimes are about whose bodies can be attacked without many people truly caring. When attacks on synagogues, mosques, black churches, Asian elders, or LGBTQ spaces spike, it's a sign that us versus them story is winning in some hearts and minds. All right. The relationship between police and communities of color is one of the clearest battlefields. Studies show Black Americans are about 2.5 likely times more likely as whites to be shot and killed by police. In the 2019 Pew survey, 84% of Black adults and 63% of white adults said Black people are treated less fairly than whites in dealings with the police. Similar majorities said the criminal justice system overall treats Black people less fairly. That gap in experience and perception is a fault line. Then came the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. Estimates suggest that 15 and 26 million people participated in BLM protests in the U.S., making it one of the largest protest movements in American history. Research found that the vast majority of over 90% of these demonstrators were peaceful. Yet by 2025, support for BLM dropped from about 67% in 2020 to around 52%, and fewer than 3 in 10 Americans believe the protests led to meaningful improvements in the lives of Black people. That combination, mass protests, perceived lack of change, and declining sympathy, is exactly how a cold civil war deepens. Loud cries for justice are met with system level resistance and then numbness, which a lot of it, is on the responsibility as well as the sort of pillars and, background puppet masters, right, of that movement as well. Right. I was hearing some stories around some funds not being properly allocated, right? Different things like that. So a lot of that falls on us too. White nationalism and the fear of genetic survival. There are people actively trying to create white only enclaves and communities, often justified by a fear of cultural or genetic extinction. White nationalism and white separatism only openly argue for a white only state. And analysts note that these ideologies overlap heavily with white supremacism. 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where white supremacists marched with Confederate and Nazi flags and one counter protester was killed, was a vivid public symbol of this agenda. This isn't just fringe internet talk, it's a deliberate attempt to redraw the map of who belongs. Rhetoric about replacement and saving Western civilization taps into deep anxieties about status and survival. All right. Spiritually, that's a war fueled by fear instead of love. A belief that for one group to live, another must shrink, leave, or disappear. Right. America doesn't just have a race problem, it has a black and white story that other groups get dragged into, right? Immigrant communities, Latino, Asian, African, Middle Eastern, Caribbean, often feel pressure to choose sides in an existing racial script, either align with whiteness or social safety and privilege, or stand in solidarity with black and other marginalized communities and risk backlash. The model minority myth and anti immigrant rhetoric and go back where you came from harassment are all a part of this battlefield, right? So, immigrants and foreigners are in a tight spot, right? Where they have to, America's pretty much black and white, man. Let's just put the shit on the table. And immigrants, right, they have to either, they can have both, right? Because with God, all things are possible. But there is this sort of like underlying tension of, man, like, fuck, I have to either choose, the white folks and, their opinions and their ideologies and how they see things and their hierarchy and their beliefs and what they believe, or I have to go with these black folks. And, but then if I choose one, I'm missing out on the other. And if I choose the other, I'm missing out on one. It's a psychological mind fuck, right, in America. And a lot of people don't talk about it because not talking about it keeps the machine running, right? We don't need you motherfuckers talking about it. Just get out there and figure it out, right? You can see the tension in debates over DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. A recent AP NORC poll found that fewer Americans now believe Black people face a lot of discrimination, right? 45% down from 60% in 2021. And many, about 30% overall, nearly 40% of white adults believe DEI initiatives actually increase discrimination against whites. When immigrants and other minorities hear that, they are thrown into a confusing narrative. Are they beneficiaries of DEI? Victims of backlash, tools in someone else's ideological war spiritually? That's the enemy using confusion and comparison to keep groups from recognizing shared humanity. All right. Love, dating, and the racial hierarchy of desire. The Civil War isn't just in Congress, it's in Tinder, Hinge, and marriage statistics, right? Online dating shows that race shapes romantic preferences in ways that mirror old hierarchies. Analysis of OkCupid data found that non black men tended to penalize black women the most, while all women showed penalties towards Asian and black men. And white men and Asian women tended to receive the most responses. Newer research suggests that dating app algorithms can actually automate and amplify this sexual racism. Wow, that's a term, sexual racism, matching users with people who look like them and reinforcing stereotypes about who is desirable. Sociologists describe this as a stratified marriage and dating market where Asian and Hispanic women are more likely to pair with white men than black women are. While most people still marry within their own racial group, underneath the romance and swipes is a quiet war over who gets to be seen as lovable, marriage material, or high status. That's civil division at the most intimate level. Hearts and beds filtered through social hierarchies. Ooh, this is so good. The growing wealth gap as a quiet front line. The old Civil War was partly about an economic system built on slavery. Today, there's a different but related economic battlefield. Extreme wealth inequality. Federal Reserve data shows that the richest 10% of American households now own more than two-thirds of the nation's wealth. 10% of American households now own more than two-thirds of the nation's wealth. More than 2/3. That's wild. Man, and the top 1% alone holds about 31%, nearly as much as the entire bottom. In 2024, the 19 richest US household gains about 1 trillion in a single year. In 2024, the 19 richest US households gained about $1 trillion in a single year, increasing their share of total household wealth. In a recent Oxfam linked report noted that the 10 richest US billionaires added nearly 700 billion to their fortunes in 1 year. When the ultra rich accumulate trillions while many Americans struggle with housing, medical debt, and food insecurity, resentment becomes spiritual kindling. People look for someone to blame, right? It's the coastal elites, immigrants, it's the welfare recipients, right? Lazy poor folks, right? Rigged systems. You see how this shit filters down to the common everyday American, just based off a response to the just massive accumulation of wealth in these households, these some of these wealthiest households in the country, and how when people at the bottom can barely afford rent, right, can barely afford just some of their basic necessities, right, and now it's like we got to find someone to blame, right, because the wealthy, you're not going to find these people, right, you're not going to get access to their communities, they're not going to, there's not a face you can point at. What can you say, right? The argument's going to be, well, you get out and go get it too. Shit, I came from nothing, right? Yeah, rich people who came from nothing. Everybody wasn't born fucking rich, right? So it's a really tight psychological space, man. You know, when we're talking about the wealth gap and this anger that comes from that, right? It says that anger can be redirected into racial animosity, conspiracy theories, or violent populism, turning class pain into tribal warfare instead of solidarity. So I have more points, but I don't have that much time because I have to go to work. However, just some things to think about. They talk a lot about civil war and oh my God, is there a civil war coming? Is there a civil war brewing? We're already in a civil war, right? We're already in a civil war. It's just we've become so advanced technologically and even spiritually in a lot of ways where we we have learned the art of being in a war while still making everything look great, calm, and peaceful and civilized at the same time. I think it needs, instead of be called it's the civilized, the ultra civilized war, right? It was a civil war. It's the civilized war, in 2025, right? But greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, right? Believers, we are called to not follow the patterns of the world, right? To be set apart, right? To trust in the Lord, right? To lean on our faith, but these are some challenging times, man. So I want to do a part 2 of this video because I think this is really important to talk about. But I hope you guys have a blessed day. Peace.